This is our Retail Renaissance Conversation webinar as part of our Accelerator program. So all about, providing brands with the relevant information to scale as successful businesses. And obviously in fashion, retail is such a huge part of that, and has changed a lot over the past few years. So that's something that we're going to discuss today. But yeah, enough about me. Stephen, would you mind introducing yourself as our resident retail expert?
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you to everyone who is watching now, and obviously people that will jump on board later in the session, or perhaps will catch up on this through the various channels that Loan Design Club will make this available from. I'm Stephen Court. I declare my interest to say that I'm an advisory board member of Loan Design Club. That essentially means I sit with a group of other very talented people. I absent myself from their talents, and what we do collectively is we try to help the team at LDC to understand all the different aspects of the environment that they occupy. And I come at it from a property, a real estate perspective, because I've spent quite a bit of the last 20 years working in that field. But to take it back, and I'll be as brief as I can to try and keep the audience enthralled. My origins are actually in the professional theatre world, theatre production rather than performance. So having undertaken a fellowship and trained at the drama school Lambda, for those of you that know a little bit about drama training, I worked in professional theatre for some years and eventually segued through using those skills into a more commercial live event sector, which essentially made me come into contact with brands, quite often retail consumer brands, who wanted to use, broadly speaking, theatrical techniques to launch new products or to say something to the world. So as I segued out of drama, I was really using those skills to help brands to cut through, to get noticed in one of the many channels of communications and advertising that they were using. I did some sort of a tour of duty on theme park development. I was at one point a Walt Disney Imagineer, which is the team at Disney that developed theme parks. And a theme park these days really is a very retail-focused business. So apart from the attractions, it's all about designing and delivering a destination which actually has an awful lot of quite conventional retail in it, both behind the gates that you pay for to get in, and obviously in and around the park, you can walk up and actually go shopping, go eating, and do lots of things on all the Disney properties around the world. So had the pleasure of working with them and doing that. But rolling forward really to my sort of more traditional retail skills, I was for some years the director of marketing and the managing director of commercial partnerships for a partner business of LDC, Hammerson, who own a lot of shopping centres and other retail locations in this country and also around Europe. That effectively put me in a direct relationship with around 3,000 retailers. And we always looked at the retail relationship not just simply as putting brands in space for shopping purposes, but to really understand those brands from a consumer perspective, to look at the econometrics, understanding actually how those brands make money. And obviously over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been an increasing prevalence for brands to go multi-channel and work in physical space as well as working online. So had a great deal of pleasure meeting the challenges of working with many retailers, small independents through to major multiples, and helping them to deliver their optimal results in the properties that Hammerson develops and owns. And more recently, I've been an independent analyst and sort of strategy advisor, again, working primarily across the commercial real estate field, still with a very, very sort of intimate connection with the retail side of the market. So spend an awful lot of time thinking about the way that retail works, and I've had a lot of really interesting sort of experiences watching the development of e-commerce and digital retail, particularly in the last decade, and trying to understand how that fundamentally affects the relationship between consumers and retail, brands, and the retail property market as well. So that's me.
Amazing, and what an introduction. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry, I've got someone knocking on my door at the moment. Do you mind giving me 1 second? And then we can
dive. It's fine. Go ahead, Amanda. That's okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll just.
Well, I'm not sure if whilst Amanda's away, I would just keep talking if you can still see and hear me. So basically, the market has changed dramatically, and I know in this session we're going to be talking about the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also I will touch upon a lot of the fundamental changes that have been taking place, which have sort of speeded up really as a byproduct of the pandemic and the lockdown. But there are lots of other tectonic shifts that have been taking place, which have been transforming retail. And I think it's fair to say that with the retail market, whenever you're in it, you always think it's changing in front of your eyes, but perhaps it's changing having not really changed very much before you started to pay closer attention to it. And frankly, that's not true. Retail is a very dynamic sector. I'm just entertaining anyone that's watching, Amanda, by sort of giving a soup to nuts on retail, but I'll hand back to you and we'll carry on.
Amazing. Thank you. Sorry about that. But, you know, you are a great entertainer in your own right. So, you know that everyone's in safe hands with you. Cool. Well, I wanted to kind of start things off by just discussing what is the current state of retail right now. I know everyone's gone through such a massive shift. Retail completely shut down. Now things are starting to pick back up again, but measures aren't the same as they were before. So what does that look like from kind of more of a landlord's perspective?
Well, right now, it's obviously in a state of flux, whether you are an investor, a landlord, whether you're a retailer, or even whether you're a consumer. These things are all very closely aligned. In the immediate term, we've obviously gone through this extraordinary period that frankly none of us of any age really have experienced before, when everything we took for granted was suddenly stopped, as if somebody just pulled the plug out, and we were not allowed to do the things that we just felt were, you know, everyday occurrences. Now, from the property and the retail perspective, it's probably been, you know, a very challenging time for both of those constituent parts. However, it's particularly challenging for the retail property side. And I don't want anyone to think that because that's really more my side of things that I'm kind of looking for the sympathy vote there. But because we're in 2020, not all by any means, but retailers were able to some extent to continue trading through alternative digital channels during this period. Not easy to do, obviously suboptimal in terms of capacity, but by and large, retail property pretty much ground to a halt. And given the nature and the structure of that economy, it is absolutely not designed to do that. It is just not something that is easy for those investors, those businesses to deal with. It's highly disruptive to the integrity of the economy. Obviously, within the lockdown, they were also faced with effectively a major disruption to their revenues, because a lot of their occupiers were themselves experiencing difficulties, which meant they either couldn't pay or couldn't pay on time or couldn't pay everything, but also because the government forced retailers, and again, I make no value judgment here, I'm not saying this is a good or a bad thing, but effectively the government gave retailers the opportunity to say to the landlords, we're not paying right now. Now that in another context goes to it's not about principles, it's about contracts. It is outside of all the traditional contracts. So it's been very challenging from the business and the economic perspective. Also very challenging because we're talking about a sector that you know, is not a sector without the consumer. And if you are seeing your consumers, or at best you're only seeing them from a distance at the tentacle end of a digital channel, to some extent you're breaking the relationship, the fundamental relationship, I think, is at the heart of retail. And I know we'll talk later about, you know, what's good about physical retail, because certainly a lot of people, perhaps younger demographics, might challenge the notion that physical retail in of itself necessarily as good as we think it is, because there are so many digital things. So it's very difficult at the moment. But I would also say that and I'll sort of just talk through the basis of this as you popped over to see who was grabbing your attention at the door, that the consumer relationship is now so fragmented that when you cannot physically go to shops, you can't go into shops, the connection breaks down, and shops aren't just places to sell. They are places where the brands themselves have direct contact with consumers. It's a feedback loop for products, for relationship with consumers that has obviously was not allowed to perform in that period. It's been a very, very trying time. And I think the final thing to say at the moment is that a lot of the fundamental issues have been magnified and exaggerated during the lockdown, were basically in place before the pandemic caused these changes. It simply made them worse in the sense that the reactions to the pandemic speeded up some of the challenges. And again, we talk a little bit around that if that's a point of interest.
Amazing. Thank you for your thoughts on where retail is now. I think it would be really interesting to kind of make a comparison between what was happening with retail before the pandemic, because we see it ourselves in various pop-ups we've had. Those are pop-up spaces that are available because stores have had to close their doors. And, you know, the high street has been changing for many years. What do you think, what was the state of retail beforehand, and what do you think was going to happen to it if COVID hadn't become a problem?
Okay, so I think first of all, and again, I don't want to get too bogged down in the history, but if you go back to the 1960s, the whole retail landscape in this country was very, very different. If you think about retail as a distribution system and the country as a body, you know, we used to have town centres, village market centres, and when you would drive out of these places, you would have these roads with little shop units on them. And the 60s was really the beginning of a modernization process and a huge expansion of the retail distribution system. Early shopping centres, later, so towards the end of the 70s, retail parks, and by the 80s and 90s, wholesale massive development of new formats of retail. So these enormous out-of-town shopping centres, and then a little later, big modern prime shopping centres. Obviously, big cities, London, Birmingham, Manchester, were also having a lot of new, larger retail formats sort of carved out of old streetscapes as well in that period of time. To the point whereby almost just before the last financial crash, by 2007 to 9, we sort of ended up with roughly 900 shopping centres, having had virtually none 40 years before, and you know, a couple of thousand retail parks. These smaller locations, generally on the edge or out of town, but with these big box units and retail formats that had sort of grown out of that expansion. And the significance of that particular growth is that they were really unchallenged by any sort of digital competition in terms of the retail economy. The retail economy broadly had kept growing every decade from the 60s. The footprints, the distribution of retail sites had continued to grow. If you bumped into a recession or something, there was a brief hiatus and then it would carry on.
But really, as we were kind of cruising towards 2010, apart from the financial problem that took place towards the end of that decade, we'd also started to see a material change in internet shopping. And that isn't just about the fact that there are some brands, that had appeared and were internet-only plays. It's also that there was another property angle to that. We were starting to see the mass rollout of logistics warehousing, which is where products get to before they get to you. The whole logistics side of the economy today has transformed in the last couple of decades, and it was really starting to shift as we moved towards 2010. And equally, the urbanization of the country, and this is pretty similar across Europe as well. So, most of the big cities, their populations, broadly speaking, were growing. Their residual populations and their working populations as well. So this concentration of bricks and mortar retail, and again, terribly dull probably for some people watching, but how it was financed. There was a wholesale revolution in the financing. Big institutions, sovereign funds, pension funds were piling money into the system in the last couple of decades, and particularly between 2000 and 2010. And all that's really changed in the last decade. Some of that has changed because we've kind of got an overcapacity of space, which is really key to the question. There are just too many shops, and some of them now are in the wrong place, or they're the wrong formats in the wrong place. There's now this increasing competition from digital channels, and they operate on different economies. So obviously physical space carries quite a heavy cost. You've got to rent the space, you've got to pay business rates on the space, you've got to employ a certain number of people, you've got to insure it and everything else. You can sort of take a lot of those costs out or reduce them dramatically if you're going to shift a lot of your retail investment online. It's not free of cost, but it can be a lot cheaper when you break it down, which is why a lot of retailers today are actually going for a multi-channel or omni-channel perspective, because they understand that they still need to have physical space, but perhaps they don't need as much as they would have had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and perhaps they need it in different places, or they need fewer things in the same places, because they can shift a lot of their sales, their transaction activity to a cheaper format as well. So in terms of what was happening before the lockdown, I think we were seeing, over 15 or 16 years, the beginning of a relatively pedestrian reduction in a lot of this space that had spent the last 30 or 40 years being built up. There's also something else to say as well, which is that, anyone that's watching this will recognize that, you are of a certain demographic and I'm of a different demographic. So you're essentially a digital native. You probably never really thought about, what the world would be like without mobile technology of some description. And whereas I can remember, when it just wasn't like that at all, when there was no internet or anything else. And your demographic is increasingly becoming significant and strategic in terms of the retail economy from a consumer point of view. Your habits are different to mine intrinsically, insofar as you probably will not travel as far to go shopping for something as I will, simply by instinct. You will probably default to using technology to look for things in a way that I might not. And, once upon a time, 10 years ago, there were fewer of you and more of me, but now that's in reverse. And of course, there's a generation behind you that are, different to you, but fundamentally that are changing from the ground up the way that retail is working today. Now, all of those things were happening already, and effectively what that means on the street is that we're seeing a change in the amount of shopping space that is needed for consumers to enter. And then at a more detailed level, I think we're seeing the changing nature of the space. And again, without getting too technical about it, these days, there's plenty of research that shows us that some people will do, if they're shopping for something that is non-essential, so that they will invest time to look at a discretionary spend, something for themselves, for their family, for a good friend. They might research online, they might research it actually inside a store or inside stores. where they buy it very much is based on the relationship that they have with the brand and maybe the nature of the product or the service that they're buying. These are all new and well, not new, but they're relatively new, but fast evolving things. And so overall, the retail economy, even in these difficult times that we're in at the moment, is a very big economy. I mean, broadly speaking, in a typical year in the last decade, the retail economy in the UK alone is worth over £400 billion a year. It's just where that transactional value and that investment value is taking place is changing. And we're starting to see investors paying more attention to non-physical retail than they've done historically in the past. But that doesn't mean that there will be no shops. That doesn't mean that investors don't want to be involved in physical bricks and mortar retail. But what it does mean is that there is a change of sentiment, and where the retail takes place, how it takes place. And for sure, as I've said, there will be less of it in absolute terms going forward. That was all sort of, that's where we were going before the pandemic hit. The main difference I think that the pandemic has done is it speeded up the transition of people shopping online. First of all, there's been quite a healthy investment in the digital retail economy during the lockdown, at the expense of what was happening in bricks and mortar retail, for sure. But I would say that in many cases, the trend hasn't changed, but the speed of change has actually been quite remarkable. And I think at a very subtle level, and again, I'll be honest with you, I live in a multi-occupancy building, so I'm often rummaging through the bins to find out where have people been shopping. And you can just tell, even in this period now, the number of home deliveries to this building has gone up, and as a proxy for the wider economy. And you know that includes people like me. I mean, there are I've been shopping online for years, but there are certain things that I've gone online for which I wouldn't have done had we not been in lockdown. And arguably now, when the lockdown is properly over, I may not just go back into my old habits. I will probably mix and match. So, you know, but I still see the value in the bricks and mortar retail. But I would say that by 2030, somewhere in the region of 20 to 25% of the existing retail stock, high street, shopping centre, retail park, retail outlet, would have effectively disappeared. It will have been redeveloped as something else, or it will have just simply become redundant and will no longer be a place where customers can go to. And that is just a response. That's a reversal of that physical growth I described at the beginning of the answer.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting what you say, because obviously you are right in that retail is not going to just disappear. The high streets aren't going to be empty and like with hay bales, you know, rolling by. But it is going to look different. And so in terms of, you know, obviously within Design Club, we are changing the way that our stores are. We're using it being digital and omni-channel, and you can scan QR codes and you can shop through the windows and you can book personal shopping appointments and things like that. And there are other things that people are doing, and obviously window displays and creating that added customer experience, you know, Selfridges handing out coconut water to people who are queuing up to come inside. Those are, you know, changes that people have created to bring people to the store and to make it more accessible for people, because people aren't just going to stop going outside.
No.
But what do you think we can expect to see for the next 6 to 12 months in terms of high street footfall? Is it possible to even tell, or are we just really, you know, batting in the dark?
Yeah, I mean, anything I say is going to be a mixture of my opinion, my professional opinion, and obviously, you know, I spend you know, hours each week trawling through research around these questions to try and understand the bigger picture as well. In terms of the next 6 to 12 months, though, I think that you know, we cannot ignore that the reasons that these extraordinary things are going on at the moment is because of the nature of the health scare that is forcing us all to change the way we do things. And so I think it's important to stress that until COVID-19 can be related to like any other seasonal illness that, you know, that passes through. I mean, look, as serious as flu is to society in general, it doesn't make society grind to a halt on an annual basis, but there is a kind of a flu season that passes through. Now, until we get to the point where this particular strain of virus sort of recedes down to that level, what's going to happen, and this is a 6 to 12 month question, I guess, is that caution will prevail. First of all, the extreme thing is, you know, there may be further lockdowns. My gut feel there is, we're seeing it now, you know, that the city of Leicester has had to go into an extraordinary second lockdown, which hasn't been the case anywhere else. But I looked at a list yesterday, and there were 28 or 29 other towns or cities in the UK that are very close to potentially having to do something similar to Leicester. So will it be a nationwide thing? Probably not, because I think, as we're seeing elsewhere, particularly in Europe, they're regionalizing the approach now. They're saying that we don't necessarily need to shut down an entire country or market, but we have to locally defend against this thing. And obviously, in the absence of there being a vaccine and other measures which will make things much safer, then we certainly, in the next 6 to 12 months, my gut feel is that we are going to see iterative changes taking place. I mean, my understanding at the moment is that footfall is kind of 40 to 50% of what we would have historically considered to be normal on a like-for-like, year-for-year basis. And that's after lockdown has been relaxed a little bit. And spend in stores is at roughly around 50%. Now, obviously, this is a generalization because retail is a very broad church, you know, with so many different categories. But, you know, when you look at the big numbers, it looks like we're operating at roughly kind of half capacity and half the spend. There's a lot more retail spend taking place, not in store at the moment. So my feeling is that picture is going to sort of be the descriptor for the next 6 to 12 months until it is much safer for millions of us to be able to venture out of our homes, to go to our places of work, to use public transport, and all of those things that are an intrinsic part of the shopping experience, or the leisure, you know, the everyday leisure pastime as well. Beyond that, I think it's more likely to be that this continuance of the sort of repurposing of retail will take place. And I mean, I am, you know, really impressed with the flexibility that Lone Design Club has sort of implemented, that you've accepted this extraordinary challenge to manifestly sort of, you know, find ways through all the channels that you have, and particularly creative ones that you've described, Amanda, with regards to the physical retail, to be there and to really understand what it's like for the consumer, to be able to say to them, look, we're going to be there, but if you don't want to cross the threshold and join us, we're going to optimize the relationship so you can stand and be part of us without necessarily coming into the store. If you want to come into the store, we can personalize that relationship. We can organize it in an extraordinary way for you. Now, inevitably, not every retailer is going to be able to do that, and it wouldn't be right in terms of the sort of the format for every retailer to do that. But I see you as a leading edge business in terms of demonstrating that retail is always about creativity, about overcoming challenges, and using technology. And actually, as you say, this rather delightful descriptor of phygital, which kind of sounds, you know, sort of can't stand still, is actually a wonderful thing, because it gets the best out of being in a great physical location in the cities where you've been able to do this, and then really optimizing the store for yourselves, for the brands that you're representing, and for the consumer. And also the big payoff there has been that the landlords that have wanted to work with you, and I'm really pleased that they have embraced your, your offer and your creativity, that the payoff for them is that it shows that, that there is a future for retail, but it cannot be a 20th century version with a few minor adjustments. It is going to have to change quite a lot as well. But certainly in the foreseeable future, I think until there is a vaccine, until it's much safer, it's going to be sort of iterative steps. And it may be in some places, it's going to be a few steps forward and a few steps back as well. But when we get back to a normal run rate again, I see more brands, creating a version of what you've been doing and actually really surfing that sort of physical digital space separately and then bringing it together rather beautifully as well. It's absolutely the future.
Well, thank you for that. But yeah, so definitely I couldn't agree more. Oh, we have a comment. Bianca says, I believe that we need to offer something that online cannot. In the future, we need to treat customers as guests, offering not just clothes, but home design, art, beauty, food and drink in a safe, inspiring environment. Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. I feel like, as you say, it's definitely going to be more about the experience of being in a store rather than, you don't get that experience. You don't get that face-to-face customer interaction online.
Yep.
If you do need to talk to someone, you're ending up chatting to a bot and it's not very helpful to you. You also don't get that. You don't get to see things and touch things and, know what it's like and feel inspired, like you say, Bianca. It's all about the design and the art and beauty, and you go into a place and you want to be inspired. When you go and look at something on a website, in the simplest terms, you're even looking at it on a model who is probably skinnier than you or, younger than you, and that's not as much of an inspiring environment rather than being treated like a guest. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. And Stephen, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I wanted to kind of ask you, and I think this ties in quite nicely, about how physical can still be used very much as a kind of marketing and promotional tool for independent brands. And it's great that, brands kind of have their online e-commerce site, but it's much harder for customers to find organically, whereas you can in physical retail. So just in terms of kind of, the current environment and physical retail itself, what do you kind of suggest for independent brands?
Yeah.
Or is it still just a focus on digital?
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, just as an afterthought on Bianca's point, I couldn't agree more with what she has pointed out and the way you've described it, because, and I think the byproduct of that, interestingly, is that what the growth in the digital retail ecosystem is doing is it's demonstrating that anything in retail that is fundamentally a commodity thing, if you can walk into a shop where you get no service, you have to basically know what you want, go in, and it is literally just a place where you are transacting, you're buying something without anything else involved. A lot of that is going to shift away from physical retail space because it no longer makes sense if you can do that. So I think one of the interesting trends that we're going to see, and it's complicated, and I'll explain why I say that in a second, is the rise of the independent in physical retail. Because first of all, I mean, again, I'll make a generalization here. Independent retailers, independent brands are hypersensitive to the customer experience because they can't afford to get it wrong too often. It's too high a risk. So they take it very seriously. They evolve their offer and the way that they relate to the customer. And obviously digital has a part of that relationship, but when they've invested in physical space, they have to optimize that. They have to really invest in that to create that relationship, that traction, that memorability. And again, you know, we are creatures, so therefore we respond well to that. And if you find good locations and a format of space that works for you, then you can bespoke your offer. And I think that really favors the independent going forward, because they just intrinsically know and fight for, you know, every relationship, whether it is a customer, a prospect, or a suspect, you know, because they have to convert people that haven't been before. And also the power of word of mouth. We all know it, that one good customer experience in a store is the multiplier effect of that is very powerful. And the cost of sales of that is practically nothing to the brands. So from the point of view of looking forward, I think if you take Bianca's point precisely, she's absolutely right that you almost have to have this very intimate, very curatorial response and relationship to what you're doing, and have to be very open with and very clear with your offer with the customer. Where the complexity is, in my view, is not with the independents. I think, you know, left to their own devices, like artists and musicians, they'll figure out a really brilliant way to do what they do. But they've got to do it somewhere, and there's the complication. Can the property sector, can they respond to that? Can they change their cost models and their charge out models to accommodate that? Because, you know, it would be brilliant, in my view, to see many more independent retail offers that can emerge in some of this space that is becoming vacant in general, and specifically because of the pandemic. But in order to do that, the landlords have to recalibrate their own businesses and their own costs. And that's quite challenging for many of them. I don't want to dwell too much on the fact that some of them, even if it's complicated, some of them will have to be dragged to do it anyway, because they just don't really want to do it either. They prefer just to make more money. And that's not a great future. So there's some working out to do on the property side to allow more space for a better, more creative, more immersive retail future, particularly for small independent brands who don't have the institutional or the banking backing of the bigger brands, and, you know, who don't have deep pockets. And but there is hope on the horizon, because there is a shift coming where the basic constructs of the leases that are the core relationship between the building owner and the occupier are changing more in the favor of the occupier. They're becoming more performance related, they're becoming more risk sharing, they're becoming less burdensome for the occupier, they're becoming shorter in nature with more break clauses. And again, I'm very conscious I'm using terms that are really going to turn some people off, so I won't go into that too much. But we're going down a direction now which is going to make it a little more feasible for more independents to get into those wonderful spaces that, frankly, for most of the last 20 years, they've been denied access to, because they haven't had the financial covenant strength to be able to do that. So I really, really welcome that. And as somebody said on the radio last week about a completely different subject matter, and I think it's a really interesting comment. They said, we should just let artists go and live in places that no one else wants to live in for 5 years, completely rent-free, because whatever they do, they just transform the place and make it really interesting. And then they start to attract people that will pay to go and live there. And at that point, they can move on and go somewhere else. And I think the analogy there is, I hope that my industry will embrace the creative changes that are taking place. Some of them are being forced to have to do that, but it should be better than that. It should be that we actually want a different kind of retail in the future, which is much more in the mold of what you've described and what Bianca has said. It won't all be like that, but it would be great to see that happen. And it normally takes a seismic event like the one we're in at the moment to do that, because it does mean that people in real estate and the investors will have to give something up to get something else.
Definitely. And that's going to be really interesting to kind of see what the high street looks like after that, if everyone's handing out free coconut water to the queue outside. At least that'll be interesting. And then, so what advice would you kind of give to brands who are currently in retail, who are currently in a physical space, and how can they kind of capitalize it and maximize it in the most kind of, to make the most out of it, instead of, you know, just relying on the location or the time and waiting for that footfall to come? What is the kind of, what's the go-getter attitude here?
Okay, so first of all, clearly there are some opportunities for independence that only exist because of the problem, because of the crisis. And so let's think about that. I think first of all, what I would say is it's a time to be bold. I mean, I've obviously made this point to your colleagues at Loan Design Club, which is don't be afraid and don't wait to be asked. You know, go to people. They can only say no if you go with an offer. So first of all, in the general sense, at the moment, a lot of retail landlords have got very, very big problems. They have an increasing inventory of available space, which just on a technical point of view, as when it becomes available and within a few weeks, the burden of business rates falls back on the landlord. So first of all, no landlords want to have empty space, particularly empty space in retail, because it just looks like a terrible void. It looks like something is wrong. Secondly, their costs go up when they have to assume. Now, I know someone's going to say, but Stephen, at the moment, the government have waived business rates. We're on a business rates holiday at the moment because of the pandemic. But ultimately, that's not going to last forever. I mean, governments, you know, one of their few jobs that they love to do is to collect tax. So they're going to be back collecting that sooner or later anyway. But in reality, landlords don't want to have that burden. They want something happening in the shop space as well. So more available space. Previously, perhaps landlords not really reaching out, probably don't actually have the contacts. Again, using the experience that I've been working with Loan Design Club, you know, I've sort of opened up my my address book to you know, to people within LDC, and I've even strong-armed a few people in the retail property sector just to see you guys and said, look, you have nothing to lose by sitting down with this management team. They've got a brilliant offer. You don't have to go for it. There's no obligation, but I think you'd regret not seeing them. And as you've said yourself, you know, you've seen a lot of more take up. You know, you're in a lot more units and you've had a lot more positive response to you working with some very prime, very exclusive landlords historically. But, you know, so I think you're a perfect example. So what I would say to other independent people that are watching this or will watch it later is be bold, put an offer together that really makes sense to, you know, that speaks to the problems that the landlord has, address their problems. We can come in into your space. We cannot pay the commercial rents you were charging before. Don't apologize for it. Tell them what the deal that you want to have. They might say yes, they might say no, but they're probably not going to find you. So go to them and actually put it to them. Explain the bigger picture issues, which are independent brands, even if they're only temporarily occupying space on a license or on a very short-term deal, and perhaps they're not even paying to be there, are also providing the landlord with a picture of success, even if it's not a long-lasting one. And that is something of value to a lot of the landlord community and the agents that often stand between the landlord themselves and the independent brands. So put together an offer that doesn't just speak about you and what you do, but look at the problems that the landlord is having and say, we can address that one, we can address that one, we can address that one. And, you know, we could probably, you know, we can spin that with you a little bit to kind of make it look good all round as well. And I would say go and put in a bit of footwork and go and see and speak to brands that you like, whether they're independents or not, and just get their experiences. Retail is a very, very hands-on business, and it's an expensive business to get wrong, particularly if you don't have a lot of funds behind you and you don't have a lot of time. So before you go and commit to wanting to get into space, just go and speak to enough people that you trust and believe in. Get some basic research. It doesn't have to be too scientific. What are the problems they've had? What did they get wrong? You know, what sort of contracts do they have with the land? I mean, not everyone's going to tell you everything, but you have to be bold, and you will learn a lot very quickly. And once you've learned it, you don't have to learn it again. And I would say, I mean, you know, LDC has generously shared its experiences quite often through its digital communication channels. You know, you're a perfect example of, you know, a sort of a lean and hungry business that takes itself very seriously, that is working with some of the highest profile landlords in the country. And there's no accident. That's because you have gone there with the right offer, with the right questions. And frankly, in the recent past, you haven't had to make many compromises to get out of the physical space what you wanted. And I think anecdotally, the landlords don't feel shortchanged with you. So with respect, if LDC can do it, maybe some other independent brands can also do that too. That happens. We see a few more independent brands. The retail media start talking about it. It may become a little bit of a movement. It may start to shift the wider industry to take a different point of view going forward. That would be, you know, a wonderful thing if we can see that happen.
Cool. And so Daniela has sent in a question saying, I am working with a luxury brand in Mozambique and we are planning on launching the brand's ready-to-wear line now during the pandemic. Do you have any advice? We are planning to launch digitally and focus on delivery.
It's very difficult for me because, again, you know, I am not a retailer and I'm not a retailer in that space. Obviously, if your primary access to market is digital channels, my gut feeling there would be that you need to have really good brand ambassadors who can relate to the market that you are positioning yourself towards. If you don't have any, or you have very limited physical space, where if it's a luxury brand, so effectively it sounds like customer will be asked to consider a high price point for a relatively high margin proposition. So it's a high consideration piece. And therefore, if you don't have, or you've elected not to use physical retail space initially, then it's going to be quite a challenge. But I am not the specific expert in that field. So that I'm almost speaking as, you know, just someone that has kind of worked with brands of that nature. I mean, personally, I would always say, and it isn't just because I'm a little bit older probably than everybody else on the call, that I think I know there are very successful independent only brands, but physical space, particularly around launch, is incredibly important. You never underestimate the power of key people in retail media. And if you're in the luxury end of the market, there are, you know, some very niche players that have huge influence over a customer base. It kind of harks back to, you know, the origins of my career in theatre. You get on the wrong side of 3 or 4 critics and your play will die very quickly. You know, the critics don't get it, they don't like it, they think it's not the right proposition. They can really undermine the success of what might actually be a good proposition. And it's quite similar not in general retailing terms, but specifically in niche areas. So work the media channels, as in the media that speak to the market, the media that access all, you know, on and offline channels. But I would strongly encourage, you know, try and get the proposition into some physical space, whether it's your own or through some retail partners, and be quite hands-on, even if your main transactional channels are going to be online, because the higher the price point, the less of a commodity, the more you need to get people on side. It's quite a complex relationship to begin with as well. But I think she needs to ask a few more people than me, for sure.
What I will say to you, Daniela, is that you probably want to sign up to our next webinar, which will be more about business structure. So
Wonderful.
That might be a useful one for you there. And just conscious of time, I'd just like to kind of ask you one more question, and then wrap things up. So just in terms of brands, so like Daniela, I suppose, who are thinking about venturing into physical retail for the first time ever, what advice do you give, and what do you think brands need to have as a business structure in order to be ready to make that step into physical?
Yeah, I think you have to have your key performance indicators, your expectation of what a physical space will deliver. I would say that you should research the space by, quite really research that the location, to make sure that it has all the attributes. So adjacencies in retail are often important. Again, depending on what sort of retail category we're talking about, clusters of brands that are either similar or associated, clustering together often works very well, because if consumers need to travel to a location, and again, depending on what we're talking about and where we are here, what is the sensitivity around that? So obviously for us in London, we know that there are strong retail centres in different parts of the city where you have this clustering effect, particularly around sort of fashion and things of that nature. So critical mass, it's better to possibly pay a slight premium or to compromise slightly on the deal to get into a space if you're going to be in the middle of a place where there are other brands. Now, some people might argue, but I don't want to be with other brands because they're, potentially, there's only, the consumer may go to them, they may prefer them. But in reality, if you're too remote for your type of consumer, they're probably going to go to that cluster anyway before they get to you. So I would say it's not a herd mentality, it's not a sheep thing, it's about go where you think the customer is going, and make a lot of noise about it, be part of that community. And in terms of the KPIs of the space, I would strenuously suggest that you talk to people that you believe have similar business models to the one you're about to launch, and ask them to be candid and honest with you about the things to look out for in terms of contracts, commitments, how much money you really need. I mean, obviously, not everyone is going to bare their soul to you, but if you're committing to a space, even if you're on a very good deal with a landlord, it's still a very time-consuming and rather expensive proposition to manifest as well. So really be clear on that and use other people's experiences. I mean, I've made a living out of telling everyone the mistakes I've made so they don't have to make them. And, go and ask people, what did you get wrong? What was wrong with it? Why did it cost you so much? What would you do that again? So you can at least narrow down the risks that you take. And if you're going into the right location, which is in a healthy cluster, which already pulls in a lot of consumers, then you can really obviously present your offer in a strong and unique way. I think creating an environment very similar to your sort of phygital environment is a brilliant way of optimizing the store experience for the brand and for the customer. So that's a really healthy mix of, beautiful, appropriate physical space, plus the advantages of the digital crossover. But also, again, use your digital channels and your social channels to get the word out. And it's retail, so promotion is key. I'm not always, and I'm not saying if it's a niche proposition to, we're getting into a kind of, bringing, price promotion necessarily, but incentivize the customer, the consumer. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the response, I think brand ambassadors in independent and niche sectors are very, very important these days, because they have tremendous viral value on social media channels, as well as obviously potentially being able to enhance, if you can get some of your ambassadors to occasionally be part of the physical space with you, that can also attract, a crowd. Be an event producer as much as a retailer in that regard. It's very difficult, spinning lots of plates, asking lots of questions, but you've got to maximize the time that you have in that physical space, and you've got to really try and whether the sale takes place online or in store, you've really got to wring out your sales per square foot metrics as well.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Stephen. That was such an informative webinar. And thank you to everyone who's taken place. But yeah, no, great. Very interesting to hear it from your perspective of things. And obviously at LDC, we've been doing this for a while. So if anyone has any questions about retail or, you know, your area, what's targeted for you, then we would always be, of course, more than happy to advise. And I'm sure Stephen also more than happy to lend some advice here and there. Absolutely. Whenever necessarily. But yeah, great. Thank you so much. Some nice comments there about everyone learning more about retail, which is great. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. And thank you so much, Stephen, yourself, for giving us your time today and all of your information. That's very useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And thanks to everyone that also checked in as well. As Amanda has said, if you have further questions that come to LDC, the team there is able to reach me. I'll always do my best to try and formulate a response so the guys can get back to you as well. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure's all ours. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone. We'll be in touch.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.